Good evening. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you to tonight's Utzon lecture and also the annual Judith Neilson Lecture. Before I start, however, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here tonight. This is the fourth annual Judith Neilson Lecture, part of the Utzon series. This lecture series invites world-leading experts here to UNSW to discuss, present, and reflect on complex challenges facing the world today. Not with a cry of despair, but with a healthy dose of so what? What do we do about it? Marrying knowledge generation with practice. All of these speakers, these last 3 or 4 years, are built environment professionals, but have strayed from their professional disciplines to explore and develop new approaches and ways of tackling complex problems. Last year's speaker, Joe De Silva from Arup, spoke on the complexities that enacting resilience, what happens to those things in a fast-changing world. The year before that, Anshu Sharma from India highlighted the need for community-led actions that reduce the threat of disasters and lead to better response. And tonight's speaker, Brett Moore, carries the same rich tradition. Brett is UNHCR's head of shelter. Originally trained as an architect, his work has been largely dedicated to recovery and reconstruction in post-disaster and post-conflict areas. Brett was a recipient of the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard University, awarded to global leaders in a range of critical issues around urbanism, housing, and equity. Prior to that, he held several key positions in other UN agencies, including UNOPS, where he managed their global architectural and engineering design team, and also World Vision, dealing with emergency deployment of shelter and infrastructure across the world. We were trying to think who would be a great fourth-year speaker in this series, and we could think of no one better than Brett, and it's a huge privilege. Brett has chosen the title, The Global Refugee Crisis, the Role of Built Environment Professionals. Please join me in welcoming Brett Moore.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be here this evening. I'd like to begin by thanking the University of New South Wales, the Dean and Faculty of Built Environment, and particularly David Sanderson as the Judith Neilson Chair for bringing me out from Geneva and having me linked to and involved with a really wonderful series of events here this week. I'd also like to thank Judith Neilson for her vision and commitment to support the faculty in bringing focus to a range of exciting and very important issues around equity, access, vulnerability, and fragility in regards to the unprecedented global shifts in humanity we are now witnessing. As David introduced, I manage the Shelter and Settlement Program in UNHCR. It's a big program. We spend around $700 million a year on shelter and settlement activities in, at the moment, around 46 countries. The annual budget of UNHCR is around $5-6 billion. It varies according to the donors and the particular crises at hand. But shelter and settlement is one of the most significant components of our global portfolio. I have around 180 staff in 46 countries, but of course the context within any of those countries varies wildly. So this evening I want to present on the global refugee crisis. I'll take you through some of the latest displacement figures, critical areas of impact, and what the global humanitarian community and UNHCR are doing at the policy level and on the ground, and what we, as Australians and built environment professionals, can do with our profession and talents to make sure we are part of the solution. So in terms of the key global figures, we're now, as I mentioned, in uncharted territory. More than 70 million people forcibly displaced. These figures were released only a couple of months ago. And they've risen a lot in the last 12 months, and you can see the trend analysis, which I will show later on. Interesting to note in this that the bulk of those that are forcibly displaced are IDPs, not refugees. Now, for a lot of people, that may not be a big distinction, but for those working in the humanitarian context, it's significant. IDPs are internally displaced people. That is, people that are forced from one part of a country to another part, but they remain citizens. If you were forced from Sydney to shift to Melbourne, where I'm from, some might like it, some not, but nevertheless, if it's a forced relocation against your free will, you become an IDP. If you are forced, if there's a calamity in Australia or conflict, and you have no choice but to flee your home and move to Papua New Guinea or Indonesia, East Timor, you're a refugee if you choose to claim asylum status. So as mentioned, these are unprecedented figures. They're the highest since World War II. You'll see some key breakdown of the figures there as well. And there's a couple of things that I'll just draw your attention to. You can see that the biggest refugee hosting country is Turkey, with 3.7 million refugees. You'll find that when we look at the map later on, that most of the refugees are accommodated in the neighbouring countries. And really, although the Western countries may cry poor and overstretched, it's only Germany that is in the top 5 refugee hosting countries. And for anyone who's been following the media the last 4 years, you will remember in 2015, 2016, and slightly before that as well, unprecedented flows of Syrian refugees on the Eastern Mediterranean route and the Balkans route from Turkey through Greece to Germany. I'll cover that a little later as well. I want to also mention here too, it goes a bit unrecognised, 3.9 million stateless people. Now, statelessness for many is something that's seen as a protracted issue that can't easily be resolved. But the relationship between refugees and their issues that are unattended to and unresolved, where states don't take on their rightful position to protect the rights of refugees, they can often become stateless. And when people are stateless, they're denied basic rights, access to education and healthcare, buying and selling of land and property, and sometimes refugees remain stateless for generations, and also IDPs. One of the first large projects I had in terms of global crisis was after the tsunami, and I was in Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka. And only after a couple of years there, it was clear to me that there was a group of people known as the upcountry Tamils. And then asking further around, what's the status of these people? They were brought as indentured labour to Sri Lanka 120 years ago. Many of them have no documentation, they can't vote, very hard to get their children into school, so they remain in a cycle of servitude, uneducated and working in plantations in the upcountry area. I'm mentioning that context because I know it well, but that context would be repeated again and again in many parts of the world. So apart from the global figures, I'll start taking you through a bit of an example of the context within which refugees live. So as you can see here, 75% of refugees live in non-camp settings. Later on, you'll see plenty of images of what the typical refugee camps look like, and you probably have quite a strong image in your mind anyway. But the reality is now that most refugees live outside of refugee camps. Now, we say around 75% because it's not like every refugee is monitored and their movement, so people come and go. But according to the registration database and then extrapolation out from the database of those refugees that are not formally registered and remain untracked, we estimate that this is about correct. Of that, we say around 54% live in urban areas because, of course, not all out-of-camp contexts are actually urban. They may be peri-urban or around the edges of camps, or people that live in peri-urban areas and work in urban areas. So defining urbanism, as many of you would know, is geographically complicated. Now, what I also want to clearly mention is, of course, that we have huge numbers of people still living in settlements. Someone asked me today in the discussion, what's the difference between a camp and a settlement? Well, a camp is a kind of settlement, but when we say camp, we have quite a reductionist view of the living conditions. Some camps are very, very open and they're kind of morphed and extended into existing host communities. So we generally refer to them as settlements. Now, it's only in the last 3 years of the tenure that I've currently had that we've put a lot more work into cataloguing the settlements. At last count, only last month, we have about 690. So that's a huge number of people. Now, of course, you would never think of UNHCR as an urban planning agency. It's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So they deal with refugee protection issues and assistance issues. But really by that statistic and by the fact that many refugee camps remain occupied well past the emergency period, we really are, by any other definition, maybe one of the largest urban planners or urban designers in the world without really knowing it or acknowledging it. And that reality led us to try to really pursue that in a significant way. And I'll come to that later on when I describe a couple of the new publications and processes we've got in play. So just to recap some of the figures. These are the most critical figures really. And as shown here, 37,000 people forcibly displaced every day is a huge number. And of course, when that is against their will. It's not migration, it's not seeking to go somewhere else for a better job, it's forced displacement, a very different thing. Now this is an interesting image because it shows the geographic breakdown. You'll see for those maybe at the back that the green shows IDPs, the red shows refugees. They're the broadest distinction, but you'll see the categorization down at the bottom here. And also very interesting to note is the trend analysis. So what can you see here? 2000, even I can't see it well myself, 2000, 2010, sharp upswing here with the Syria crisis and a steeper curve that's trending there as well. Here, worthy of note, is this is not the Venezuela situation, this is the IDP crisis in Colombia. Millions of people are displaced in Colombia through decades, generations of the civil conflict there between the government and FARC and other groups. You'll see here also DRC, decades of protracted crisis that's really pushed millions of people from their homes as well. DRC, Central African Republic, Burundi, Tanzania, the Central African, what we call the Great Lakes crisis. Cameroon, Niger, and all around the Great Lakes, there's constant displacement and movement. How do we respond to this? I'll take you through two particular approaches. One of the global processes that are emerging, and then I'll speak more about the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. So we're starting big and kind of going in narrow. How is it coordinated? All these different UN agencies, all these NGOs and all these different actors, what's the ordering mechanism by which they plan their work, their projects, their resources, their teams? When we're talking about IDP contexts, we talk about the cluster system. Now, of course, there's been humanitarian work that's been going on for decades, but the reality is that it was only really from 2005 onward that the whole humanitarian community got together under what's called the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, and started agreeing on certain structures to try to improve the process, stop wastage of resources and duplication of efforts. And they structured it around what we call the sectors. So the other part of my job is co-leading the Global Shelter Cluster. You'll see it here. So the Shelter Cluster is the collective of humanitarian agencies that respond to natural disasters and conflict-induced displacement with shelter. It's led by UNHCR in conflict contexts and by the IFRC, International Federation of the Red Cross, in the context of natural disaster. So we try to coordinate the whole process. It's coordinated out of Geneva. So my job is kind of split somewhat schizophrenically in half. Half is the coordination of all the interagency mechanism, and the other half is the program, the UNHCR operational side, which I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. So different UN agencies and other actors, they've divided the pie of humanitarian response into these categories as a way of trying to improve the coordination of the process and better allocation of funds, faster responses, more appropriate responses, more accurate targeting to people in need. As part of the global coordination process, we've had a few interesting moves in the last couple of years. One that I want to highlight is the Global Compact on Refugees. Now, this has been prepared with member states for several years, but it was only really agreed upon last year and ratified at the end of 2018. I won't go through it in great detail, but really what it is a way of trying to respond to the global refugee situation through easing pressure on the host countries. As I mentioned, most refugees are hosted in the neighbouring countries around their country of origin, supporting refugees more directly with self-reliance and moving away from the humanitarian welfarist approach and expanding third country solutions. By that we mean that where the refugees are hosted, that they don't reside there, there is a third country where they can be resettled. Complementary pathways refers to scholarships, grants, working visas and other kinds of resettlement approaches that don't necessarily include refugee status in a regular pathway. So also the fourth element there is around supporting conditions. So really that fourth one is quite hard to achieve because supporting conditions in countries of origin for voluntary safe return, that is the key premise of how we respond in humanitarian context. You always first opt for the return of people to their place of origin if safe and when voluntary. Secondly is adequate hosting conditions in the country of displacement, and thirdly is resettlement to a third country. They're the three pathways that we program around. Now, in order to achieve this, we have a big event coming at the end of the year, the Global Refugee Forum, which will bring all of the member states together, diplomats, representations, to get global pledges on how we're going to achieve this. But one of the biggest financial mechanisms that's currently in play is linking to the World Bank, a very interesting approach where the World Bank basically recognised that many of those refugee hosting countries, they're already recipients of World Bank development grants. But because they're hosting such huge numbers of refugees, it's actually an impediment to development. So they set up a separate funding mechanism under the International Development Agency. It's called the IDA 18 Refugee Sub-Window. It's around $680 million. $2 billion between 2017 and 2020. Already since November last year, $572 million has been dispersed to 12 operations in 7 countries. The eligibility criteria for the country to receive World Bank funding for their refugee hosting is that they must host 25,000 refugees or more, which for many countries is not that much of an ask, or must account for at least 0.1% of their population, have an adequate framework for refugee protection, and have an action plan or strategy with concrete steps. Now, typically the funds are a mix of grants and soft loans. For those countries, people that know the World Bank loan structure, for those countries that are susceptible to debt stress, it's more a grant than a loan. For those countries that are classed as not susceptible, it's a soft loan, so it's a concessional loan that's repayable, sometimes at 50% grant loan component. So the Global Refugee Forum, which takes place at the end of the year, is trying to get the global community, including the member states, to start planning and implementing their obligations as signatories to the Global Compact. I won't go through the detail, you can quickly read it there yourselves, and you'll see what the focus areas are and what the goals of the process are as well. So that's the global kind of policy framework. I'll get into technical in a moment, but what I want to kind of just quickly touch on here is the whole idea of why are we even doing shelter? Why aren't I up here? Why am I not here talking about health or education or all the other things that are really important to people? The reason why I'm not talking about that is because that's not my job, but secondly because there are some really clear global conventions that make UNHCR do what it does. And when I was preparing this presentation on the weekend, I found out a lot of interesting information that I didn't know. So I won't go through the huge amount of detail, but something that was very interesting for me was I've always known about the Refugee Convention. UNHCR began in 1951. The Refugee Convention was around, it was actually 1950. It was enacted in 1950, but the convention was 51. But it was built on the backs of the World War II refugee response within Europe. Before that, of course, there was the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So there's two significant global instruments which assign the responsibility of shelter to UNHCR. And there are four others as well. 1966 Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 11. 1969 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Very significant convention. And many of you would know 1989 Convention of the Rights of the Child, which was pioneered by Save the Children and UNICEF. So all of those documents inscribe a particular responsibility to UNHCR to do shelter and settlement. And you can see the wording there. Refugees and asylum seekers should receive all necessary assistance. This was expanded through in the 1980s to include IDPs. As I mentioned, we cover refugee and IDP contexts. There's something here that I just want to read, and I want to get the detail right, so I'll read it properly. When I went through this data on the weekend, it was very interesting for me to note that and I read the tabulation of the debate in 1950 when it was agreed what UNHCR should or shouldn't be doing. At that time, the debates in the UN were around how many of the elements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should apply to refugees. How real should we see refugees? As completely equal to citizens? Somewhat less. What rights should they have? And when I was reading, it was like Hansard. It was a list of the debate. You can find it online. It's kind of fascinating. And even the geopolitics of it at that time is very true to this day. Many of the receiving states of refugees, including the UK, were quite vocal that it already had a housing crisis and could not adequately accommodate its own people. Of course, this was only a few years after the World War II German Blitz in the UK, a lot of London's destroyed. So no wonder they're saying we shouldn't assign housing as a right of refugees. We can't even house our own people. But some South American states in Yugoslavia said that refugees should be provided the same conditions as citizens. But that text was voted against and replaced with shall accord to refugees lawfully staying in their territory treatment as favourable as possible, and no less than accorded to aliens generally located in the same circumstances. It was like, aliens, what do they mean? So I looked up alien in that context, how it was used at that point in time, and it said a legal alien is a foreign national who is permitted by law to be in the host country. Do you think Australia still subscribes to that? I'm not quite sure. And that's 70 years ago. For me, the most positive outcome of this debate and subsequent enshrinement in convention and then within national legislation in many states is that shelter, habitation and housing, whatever you want to refer to it as, it's different parts of the same piece of string in my mind. It's seen as a fundamental and necessary intervention in terms of well-being as much as health or food or education and in the way it's articulated. And of course, there's a logic to this because it wasn't too far in the past before this was enshrined, barely 5 years out of World War II and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was written on the back of a destroyed Europe and well into the Marshall Plan reconstruction process and the beginnings of the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which became the World Bank. So that was the origins of a lot of this. I'll go on to the next point. So they're the international legal instruments, conventions and frameworks. We have our own internal policies as well that frame what we do. I won't go through all of those, they're available online. Then there are those shifts in the global humanitarian system, the New Urban Agenda by UN Habitat, Grand Bargain work streams which came out of the World Humanitarian Summit, and as I mentioned, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration, which is significant as well as a different kind of framing approach. Of course, we try to make all the work focus in terms of development outcomes to the SDGs. Internally in my team, I'm going down to the next level of detail now, right back to the earlier slide I showed about protracted crises and refugee camps. I've been in the role 3 years, and we've developed this only within the last couple of months after years and years of trying to work out how do we do refugee camps better. For about 2 decades, sometimes it's been as sophisticated as a grid on the ground, everyone gets a tent, and then you just get in there. Sometimes you're there for years, so that's completely unsatisfactory. So for me, it was, how do we start designing refugee camps using the best of the approaches of what an urban designer or an urban planner would? And we distilled that down to 10 key principles. It took a lot of work because really it was 5 years of a degree and 20 years of experience distilled down to a handbook for someone who's never had anything to do with it before. So of course it's challenging trying to implement this change, but we'll see how we go. And that's been a pretty significant process that we've pushed internally. On the cluster side of things, appropriate for urban contexts and IDP contexts, we're really pushing hard with trying to get processes working better for urban refugees. And there's a few new publications and case studies out there as well. And lastly, we have the Urban Shelter and Settlement Guidelines, which we've co-authored with UN Habitat, and building that around a framework that easily relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. And very broadly, you'll see here, outside a conventional construction or built environment approach. So when we're planning a program, what's all that about? I mean, we plan it really from the perspective of there's a life-saving element, and we really try to make sure that when planning all the interventions, it doesn't matter what country you're in, that you try to minimize conflict between refugees and host community, and you favor an integrated approach. So really it's around peace building and urban social cohesion. And the big thing at the moment, of course, for us is to try to change the narrative, because there still lingers this idea that refugees are a net economic burden on the hosting country. All the data shows that to be incorrect. So there's a lot of information out there at the moment that refugees bring economic growth and development to hosting countries. There may be social challenges, cultural challenges, religious challenges, other kinds of challenges, but if we look at the economics of it, it stacks up. So now I'm going to get into a few practical examples. 5, in fact. I'll go through 4 quickly and one will take a little bit longer. So I'm going from the historical overview, the international legal instruments, the policy framework, the internal guidance, the technical approaches. Now what happens when you're on the ground? If you're an architect, an engineer, a planner, or some other technical officer on the ground, what's the day-to-day work and what kind of context are you working in? Most of these photos are mine. This one was from 2009 in Sri Lanka, in the kind of last bastion of resistance of the Tamil population in the Vani. This is near a town called Vaunia, north of Vaunia, northeast of Vaunia, near Mutupatalan. So you can see here, how do you implement a shelter project, emergency shelter project, where there's heavy aerial bombing, maybe half a kilometre away. And this went on for months. Somalia, 2017, sorry, that's a mistake. It isn't 2017, that was 2011 and 12. I took that photo. Complicated scenario in Somalia. We have a country that's really had 40 years of conflict ever since the collapse of the Siad Barre regime in the early 1970s. Overstocking, overgrazing, climate change, pressure on landscape, traditional nomadic agro-pastoralist communities forced into peri-urban areas because of drought, weaponization, fighting, tribal conflict, clan, sub-clan, sub-sub-clan conflict. Returns processes from Dadaab, the Kenyan government moving 125,000 people last year from Dadaab, the big refugee camp in Kenya, back into Somalia, into Kismayo, Jubaland, south central area. So you've got a really mixed caseload. You've got IDPs, you've got refugee returnees, and you've got Syrian refugees in Somalia. So how do you program for people where there hasn't been a functioning central government or state for several decades? There's no banking system, and there's no system of land governance. So you're really working through systems of complicated local processes of negotiation with the Sharia courts, the Council of Elders, to get permission to build. Sometimes when you do build, immediately people are ejected and it's occupied by armed groups. In 2016 in Aleppo, at the big exodus of Aleppo, when there was a heavy assault on the city, people were taking, of course, everything they could with them. They took every productive asset that was left in their homes. We have a huge IDP problem in Syria, of course. We think about Syrian refugees in the neighbouring countries and then on the European pathway. But inside Syria, there are millions, 4 million more, 7 million in fact, IDPs in the country. And they are located from one destroyed place to another destroyed place. How do you provide a meaningful shelter program in a context like that, where there's heavy structural damage? So we have a lot of challenges. I was there in November, actually, looking at the returns process in eastern Ghouta, on the outskirts of Damascus. And really you drive continuously for 50 kilometres, 80 kilometres, and it's completely flattened. And this was a developed country. Syria was the powerhouse of the Middle East. It's agriculturally very fertile. A wonderful place, actually. It's a complete tragedy what's happened there. The discussions I had with people from the World Bank and others, the current price tag, they're estimating $200 billion will cost to reconstruct Syria. Who will pay for that? The West won't. The West aren't even on speaking terms. So we've really got a problem in what will be the longer term reconstruction plan for Syria. If you look at it on a kind of value basis, it's twice the value, or twice the cost rather, of what the Marshall Plan was for the reconstruction of Europe. So in terms of sectarian interests, business interests and other interests, we've still got a long way to go with what can meaningfully happen for the reconstruction of Syria, especially the urban context, and especially considering, maybe like Sydney, like Melbourne, like many cities, most people are renters. And the international community, the humanitarians, we mostly rebuild for owners, not renters. So there'll be a huge population that won't see benefit out of the process as well. There's a lot of intractable, wicked problems with this. European crisis. So I'll just go back to my slide, my text for this. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention on the European crisis. Most of the time we're working in developing countries. When humanitarians are working in developed countries, it's not an easy fit. Most of our practices, approaches are built around developing country approaches and often rural contexts. So we have the double challenge of urban contexts and developed country context. So it's very hard for a lot of the UN agencies and the humanitarians to work in the European crisis. But who could forget the scene in 2015 when more than 1 million refugees reached Europe across various routes, and who would have imagined that Germany would welcome in more than 1 million Syrian refugees? Many forget there are still more than 100,000 arrivals in Europe each year, including last year and probably this year as well. But now it's mostly via the Western Mediterranean route. However, as you would have noted, the political climate in Europe has changed much in the last 4 years, and it will be unlikely that any country will accept refugees as Germany did. I was recently at a conference in Nairobi. It was the UN Habitat Assembly there in May, and I was on a panel with Ulrich Sierau, who was the mayor of Dortmund, and he told me an anecdote which I have wanted to repeat. He said to me he was at his granddaughter's football match, and he gets a phone call from the Minister of Interior saying there's several thousand refugees arriving in Dortmund at the main train station tomorrow. Chancellor Merkel has agreed to let the Syrians in after months of stalemate. So the Syrians are coming. You need to be ready tomorrow morning. And for those that remember that situation, it was remarkable. The Germans were, in my mind, like, their understanding of the situation and the sophistication with which they responded was amazing. You know, people at the train station giving flowers, giving food, hugging people, holding signs saying you're welcome. But remember, it didn't last long. The process that Germany and many European cities went through was documented last year in a very interesting OECD publication called Working Together for Local Integration of Refugees and Migrants. They looked at 70 countries and 16 large European cities and tried to collate the best practice into a guidance note of 12 points, 12-point checklist on refugee inclusion. I noted that 2 of those points of the 12 specifically pertain to the built environment. Now, this was a piece of research done by social scientists and economists. So for all the built environment professionals and others in the room, you won't be surprised to find that 2 of those 12 points that pertain to built environment, one is access and quality of housing as critical for refugee integration. Access to housing and quality of housing. Who doesn't think that's important for their own lives? So of course the refugees have the same needs. The other one was spatial aspects, where refugees are settled, and the importance of public space and access to shared facilities and civil society processes. Now, to me, that sounds remarkably like SDG 11. So really, after all this analysis, all these countries, expensive reports, you know, we're concluding that refugees need the same as what we do. Now, the 5th and final example is it's a few more images, but I'll go through it quickly. This is from August 2017 in Bangladesh, the Rohingya crisis. We had, in 6 weeks, 2 months, nearly 700,000 people cross the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. That was one of my staff's drone image that he took after a couple of months. So the sheer pace at which people were, you know, maybe just sound a little clinical, but colonising the landscape was amazing. The forest was just going down by metres and metres every hour as people were claiming space, cutting down trees, using it for firewood. When I was there, people were so desperate, they're digging up the roots of the trees, drying them on the roof of the shelter to use as firewood. So there's just a couple of images I'll go through there. Aerial photography of people trying to find dry land. That's the older refugee camp of the previous Rohingya caseload from 20 years earlier. Some of the heavy infrastructure approaches that were put in, we're spending, the 3 main agencies, UNHCR, IOM and WFP, that are doing heavy infrastructure, we're spending $1 billion a year on this one camp. Now, of course, there's a cyclic monsoon. The first year, people died. Second year, less. And now we're right at the end of the monsoon season. However, there's a high likelihood of cyclones at the end of the monsoon season. So people are still really taking shelter. They're taking everything they can. They're taking their goats, getting across the water, and going to dry land and really just occupying it and staying overnight until the floods subside. So what would you do there as a shelter officer or a site planner? You do a lot of flood risk analysis. We'll use satellite imagery. We'll do landslide analysis, slope stabilisation, paths, roads, and lots of shelter. 180,000 units in 12 months, which is a mighty feat by any standard, but also a lot of infrastructure to try and get people access to schools and clinics and education and mosques and all the other things that people need. So I'll just kind of conclude some of my remarks. What can we do as designers, built environment professionals? What are the complexities? Often one of the biggest ones for us is, who is your client? When we're trained as an architect or an engineer, often the client is the one that gives you the project and provides the funds. In the humanitarian world, you don't easily have a client. You have a donor. Sometimes it's your own agency. Sometimes it's multiple donors. Sometimes it's local government. In the end user, the beneficiary is the person that will occupy your shelter, but they didn't provide the funds or the project. They're just the end user, which of course you're doing the work for. So sometimes it's very unclear as who is controlling the process. You have some donors that give a little fund but want a lot of influence. Some have a lot of money and very little influence. And it comes offline and online throughout the duration of the process. So there's very complicated governance structures around implementing projects in the humanitarian context. Resources, underspending are a problem. Underspending? What do you mean underspending? I remember coming back to Australia for Christmas a few years ago and speaking to some friends who are architects, and they said, oh, how's work? I said, oh, we've got all this underspending, it's a problem. And they said, underspending? It's a real problem if you don't spend what the donors give you because you can't return it, it's a grant. Now I'm saying that because that just describes very clearly the inverse economic logic of implementing a humanitarian shelter project. You start with the money and your ultimate aim is to spend down to zero and finish the work. The opposite of conventional architecture, where you have the money and you spend as little as possible, you try and save as much as you can for the client and still get the project done on time. So there's a perverse logic sometimes to implementing projects, where it's built around spending as much as you can as quick as you can, which doesn't always equate to quality, as we would know. Social cultural issues, short time frames. Often they're annual planning cycles and funding cycles. So here I want to really mention about what is the role for us, for people like us. How best can we connect as individuals and as a community through developing professional inroads into the global refugee crisis? How can we support local approaches and solutions when high-level political engagement is problematic? Why should Australians be concerned about the global humanitarian crisis and refugees? We've got some wicked problems we're dealing with. We've got rapid urbanisation, as we stated earlier. I haven't really covered climate change in this discussion, but suffice to say, I was assuming that everyone was linking this nevertheless. We're not really looking closely at the link between conflict-induced displacement, climate change, fragility. It's a big issue in the UN system, peace-building missions, stabilisation missions. So linking through these various themes and trying to understand how you should create a project, a program, project team to work within this political context is complicated. Why it's important to do this kind of work, and maybe there's some kind of call to action that I'm saying for us to become more involved in refugee issues collectively. Global displacement is a growing trend, and we have to have the theoretical understanding and practical solutions for how to work according to these unique conditions of global movement. Although Australia is isolated, it is clearly part of a globalised world where issues are intrinsically interconnected. This is true at family level as much as it is at the nation-state level. For example, a Syrian family living in Western Sydney or a South Sudanese family living in Wollongong, they witness their hometowns bombed and burned on a daily basis. Their families are suddenly out of contact and they live in trauma on a daily basis. This trauma is now transnational. In a globalised world, it isn't just global trade and political agenda that's transnational. Australia is connected on a very personal level with active conflicts and refugee needs globally. There are brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, husbands and wives that are separated and live with daily updates from family on what is happening on the other side of the globe. The living conditions are transnational, and this cannot be ignored. People ask me, how did I do this? How did I get into this? Why am I interested in this? This is like a graphic of my journey. I did architecture at Melbourne University, but I was always interested in issues of social justice, human rights, politics. There was no pathway for me. I really just went and volunteered. And then one job followed another, followed another, followed another. For me, the tsunami was a tragedy for the hundreds of thousands of people that lost their lives, but for me it was a great professional opportunity, as horrible as that is to acknowledge. So I've had a lot of interesting experience and worked in more than 20 countries in the last 18 years. And now I've had a chance to reflect during my time at Harvard, and then kind of start energized in this global role with UNHCR. What about us? What have I learned and what's needed? And what can we do professionally as academics, as architects, and as students? We can think about where we fit in the overall process, emergencies, transition, permanent reconstruction. We have a lot of skills to offer. We can think about conflict and we can think about disaster and where we fit into those two distinct approaches. We can think about how we fit into teams. I mentioned today in discussion with some of the attendees at the lunchtime session that for me the best learning that I did was from social workers and from teachers, because the team that I was working with in Somalia, they know how to work with groups. As architects, we've been trained to work from the project manager perspective. And that wasn't useful when you're working with displaced communities. So having to retrain and rethink what I thought was the way to run a project, I just used to think, if you've got enough money and you convince people, you'll get something done. It takes more than that. It takes a very slow, quiet way of working in disaster-affected communities, in Indigenous communities, in sensitive ethnic and religious communities, because it is the most vulnerable that are affected. It isn't the wealthy. The wealthy can take care of themselves. They've got insurance. It's the poor and the vulnerable. In the end, are the needs that different to what you have on a daily basis? No. It's how you deliver it which is completely different. So it's about understanding complexity and working in a different context. So my final words on the matter. For me, this story is not one of despair or hopelessness, but it's one of challenge. There are many stories of refugees finding brilliant ways to support themselves and others. If you check the UNHCR website, you'll see many. For me, it's a story of how to work with complexity. Are we up for the job? Do we as citizens, as professionals, have the capacity to understand and find meaningful inroads into working in these global challenges? How do you work across disciplines? What does that even mean? Working across architecture, design, social work, law and health. Create new hybrids that use the best of technology and creative approaches to meet the challenges. Maybe education is already moving in the right direction. Maybe that's why we're all here tonight. It's truly crucial for us to be thinking outside our own disciplines and our own education and our own comfort zone, being outside, working across boundaries, and I mean that disciplinary boundaries and the physical boundaries outside our contexts. Final word. I hope I've been able to provide some food for thought and help us think about the linkages across various aspects of humanitarian work and how shelter and settlement programs play a critical role in achieving protection and development outcomes. Clearly there's much more that needs to be done, and as the numbers of forcibly displaced people around the world tragically continues to grow, I hope you now have a better understanding of UNHCR, what it does, but really also of some of the limitations of the UN system and how in the end it's active and engaged citizens that can help find answers necessary to build peace, have the skills to work in complex humanitarian contexts and work with others not as people in need but as partners. On a personal level, it's my goal that we all have the empathy and the compassion, as well as the energy and the motivation, which is what it really takes. These are the main resources that the humanitarian world needs. We have to build the collective capacity to keep responding and really to keep working with those that are most in need to ensure that in the end nobody is left outside. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brett. You covered a formidable amount of ground, and I can't even begin to summarize pithily anything that you're saying. We want to invite you to a reception that begins at 7 o'clock. So before that, we do have time for some questions. Everyone would like to ask a question. I'd ask two things. One, please give us your name, and any great question is short and has a question mark at the end. Thank you, sir. And I think there are roving mics. The man in the blue. blue jacket.
Hi, my name is Kerwin Datu. I'm both a practicing architect and an economic geographer. My question is just, because it didn't really come up, could you speak a little bit to the longer term dynamic of livelihood, capacity building and exit, knowing that the last of those is one of the most extremely problematic aspects of the work that you have to do?
Should we take, how much time we've got? Should we take a couple of questions, or how would you like to go?
Oh, yes, okay, yes, a couple more questions. We can bundle them up.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentation. My name's Mark England. I'm wondering, are there chunks of the world where the UN doesn't have access? In other words, there's a lot more going on that the UN can't assist with.
Hi, my name is Marian. I worked in Pakistan during the 2010 to 13 flood displacement, and one of the things that we noticed was there's a global, like a response time, like it's quite delayed with the UN agencies. And then also with how is crisis judged? Is it judged by numbers, or is it judged by the extent of damage? And then there's also this issue of exhaustion in global giving, because people are just giving, and disasters and crises keep coming up. And then the last thing that I would really appreciate some words on is actually the climate footprint of this response work, because, is that being monitored? How much, how much carbon footprint is this response raising? Is it adding to the climate? Thanks.
Thanks. That was 5 questions in one, but I did have a question mark at the end, but many questions. Okay. I'll try and kind of wrap them up and really address the collection of the issues you raised. I might not have made it clear, but I mean, very much we do multi-sector programming. It's rare, if ever at all, I can't even think of a case where we just go somewhere and do a shelter project. It's done as part of a large community mapping, needs assessment with water, sanitation, health, livelihoods. The particular intersection between livelihoods and shelter, though, is very interesting for me, because there's an ample opportunity and we are moving, heavily away from just a distribution approach to a much more participatory approach, of course, and that's a trend within the last couple of decades. But livelihoods, especially around training people to work, is important. Somalia 2011 was a big one for me because, there was a huge youth population. There are in most developing countries. The youth population, especially in countries like that, they're at risk of radicalisation. So you have to employ the youth. That's where you'll get the best results. That'll create futures. It's no use employing, you have to target the youth. It has to be as part of a larger engagement program. So working through the social mechanisms, the mosques, the Sharia courts, to engage the youth and train them in things that would earn them some income and contribute to the reconstruction activities. Carpentry, welding, block making, that kind of thing. So you get this, multiple outcomes of engaged youth, employment opportunities, career prospects, triggering, igniting the reconstruction approach, and overall improving the quality of the built environment with some kind of DRR aspect. So that was a good example there. Exit's hard when you're looking at chronic crises. A bit easier, I must say, a little bit easier in natural disaster, because there's a rapid onset natural disaster, flood, volcano, typhoon, whatever it might be. And although it's very complicated, there still is somewhat linear trajectory from the emergency to recovery to reconstruction. You don't really find that in conflict. The conflicts go on. They don't normalise mostly. That's why people are displaced in these protracted crises with this never-ending humanitarian context that goes on. Access. You asked me about access. That's right. There's many places where we don't have much access. Large parts of Syria, there's active conflict in the north. Just north of Aleppo, Idlib, it's getting bombed now. It's getting bombed every day. It still is. So there's a huge amount of the world that we don't get access to, sometimes because we're not allowed. The UN doesn't act unilaterally. It acts at the request and invitation of the host country. So we have to be allowed in. Most of the time there's some UN presence there, normally have the development actors there long term. The head of the UN presence in the country is called the ResRep, the resident representative. Humanitarian responders might come in later but might not have had a permanent presence there, whereas the development actors may have. Pakistan. I was there too, in Peshawar and Multan at the same time, but I don't recognise you. So, yeah, okay. Delay time, absolutely, and it depends whether you have an existing presence on the ground or not, but often you channel funds through NGOs, INGOs, and development actors on the ground, so you kickstart even without you being there. UN's slow to move, but when it does move, it moves in a big way. And, I mean, even now, like, there's so many crises around the world, the Great Lakes, Cameroon, displacement, Burkina Faso. I sent one of my staff for 5 weeks to Burkina Faso. Since January, 280,000 people have been displaced because of Boko Haram activity in the north. Displacement context in Burkina Faso, refugee movement across into Niger, now ongoing destabilisation of Togo and Benin and countries like that. So there's stuff happening everywhere all the time. It's this constant movement. Donor fatigue, absolutely. There is donor fatigue. If you mapped all the humanitarian crises in the world, if you mapped where the Australian government puts their aid money, most of it would have to go to sub-Saharan Africa, but it doesn't. Most humanitarian aid is geopolitical and it's strategic. Australian aid money goes to where it is politically necessary for the government to put it. So we don't always have a needs-based response. We have a politicised response, but that's the way it always has been. So just to kind of recognise the reality of that as well. Those crises that get the most funding are the ones that get the most media attention and the ones that the donor countries have the biggest stake in, sometimes through colonial, post-colonial reasons as well. So there's historical reasons too, rather than just purely the severity of the disaster. If you look on the OCHA website, nearly all the big UN agencies, they have severity ranking indexes and activation protocols where there has to be a certain level of damage or proportion of the population affected, and you have a L1, L2, L3 emergency, and there's funding and response protocols that are linked to that as well. Donor fatigue, climate. You mentioned climate. What was that last part?
Well, I just was wondering, are you mapping out how much...
Climate footprint, that's right. Yeah, I remember now. Not easy to do, but what we do have is part of a UN-wide obligation called Greening the Blue, and that is to look at the carbon footprint of all the operations, look at vehicle emissions, generators, and they're trying to put a lot more solar in. So it's all available there on the UNEP website, and they mostly get around that through carbon offsets at the moment. But there's active ways of trying to put in a lot more solarisation, solar-powered water pumps, solar-powered generators as well.
But in terms of your...
We're pretty much out of time. But can I invite you to come to our session afterwards? Before we thank Brett one more time, can we click your clicker? Oh,
Right.
is that the one? It's the next one. Wonderful. Please come and join us at the reception at the Red Centre. You come out of the Ainsworth building and take a left and walk towards Anzac Parade. And it's the opening night of a fabulous exhibition of undergraduate works, and there's drinks and nibbles, and Brett, you'll be there as well.
I'll be there.
So that's good news. But thank you once again for coming, and let's thank Brett one more time.
Thank you.